All right. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this session for Tenant Detective, and really for joining us throughout the whole day. I think this has been hopefully helpful to everybody, and we're so happy to have you here. So my name is Nicole McEntee, and I'm with the Education and Outreach Division at OTA. So what we do is we go out and talk to tenants about what their rights are, and more importantly, like how to form a tenant association and connect with the tenants throughout the building and have your elections and, work with the landlord to make changes to the building and all of those types of things. So in that spirit, we came up with this class called Tenant Detective. And somebody said it's the Sherlock Holmes class, and that's true, it is. So the idea is that a landlord can look up the tenants all the time, right? So every time a tenant applies for an apartment, the landlord's going to screen you for all kinds of information. But how do you screen your landlord? What can you find out about your landlord? And this applies to you whether you're looking for an apartment and you haven't moved in yet, or even if you're in an apartment and you want to look up your current landlord to make sure that they're doing things they're supposed to be doing. So this is really, and I'm going to take questions at the end if that's okay. Yeah, it applies to anyone who's a tenant. Yep. So whether you're in a single family home, whether you're in a 100-unit building, this applies to really everybody. So that said, this is our Tenant Detective class. I have a handout for everybody that I've left on your chairs with all of the links to all of the things I'm going to be talking about in this session. So hopefully you can use that as a resource. And we also have this class available on our YouTube page. So if there's something you missed, we're going to post the recording of this, but we also have it available as well on our YouTube. So the goal of this class is to empower tenants to use what's publicly available on the internet, on DC rental properties, to evaluate whether the landlord is complying with DC housing laws. So this is all using publicly available information. This is all stuff that you guys have access to just as much as me working at OTA. Now, I do want to sort of preface this and caveat this by saying, if you find a record on there, something about a violation or something with your landlord, it doesn't mean your landlord's evil or bad, right? Like one record doesn't tell the whole story. So this is a way for you to find that information, but don't take finding something to mean, oh, they're evil, I have to move out. So understand that just because a record isn't available as well, doesn't mean that the landlord has a clean slate, right? So maybe you look up your landlord and there's nothing that you see on the database. That doesn't necessarily mean that the landlord is perfect either, right? So the existence of records doesn't necessarily point to a bad landlord or a good landlord. It's just more information for you to have as background. So to begin, I want to talk about the difference between an owner and an owner's agent. So there's a difference sometimes between the owner of a rental unit or the landlord who owns that property, who paid for that property, and the management company who's operating the unit or the building, right? So you might have a management company who doesn't actually own the building. So they might be there day to day in the leasing office, but they're not actually the owners of the building. So when you're looking up this information online, you could look up both, right? You could look up the name of the owner and that management company to find out maybe how that management company operates, for example. So you can research both the owner's name, which is usually located on the first page of your lease. It's usually in that first paragraph, and the management company. And keep in mind that management companies can change over time in the same building, right? So who's lived in a building where you've had a turnover of management companies? Yeah, right. That happens frequently, actually. So just because you're looking up a building and you have one management company at this point, or maybe there was a different company in the past, they might not operate the same. So keep all of these caveats in mind when you're looking up this information. So what kinds of information can you find online in these publicly searchable databases? Everything here is stuff you could look up today, right now, if you wanted to, for your own rental housing. So the first thing, and this comes up the most frequently, is housing code violation notices of infraction. So if your landlord has infractions and they have not yet been abated, you can find those online. And I'll talk about what that means in a minute with the not yet been abated. You can also look up their basic business license to make sure that they have a business license. Sometimes they don't. They should. You could look up the certificate of occupancy. If your landlord is listed as an LLC, You could look up LLC registration names and addresses to some extent. You can find a little bit about that, though they're good at sort of obscuring that information. You can look up lead-based paint infractions to find out, have there been infractions at this property with lead-based paint that they didn't abate, that they were supposed to take care of. You can look up rent control registration, TOPA filings, eviction lists, right? Does this landlord evict tenants? That's something you can find out. And DC Superior Court records are also publicly available. In most cases, there are some that are sealed, but there are a lot that are publicly available too. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Department of Buildings Landlord Violations Tool. And this is a picture of what the screen looks like when you go to the website that's listed on the page there for you. So it's the DOB public dashboard. And there's a lot of information here. It's not just rental housing information. It's not just violations. It's also, like information about vacant properties. So if for some reason, if you wanted to look up about a vacant property next door, you could do that. Permits, you can find out information about what permits have been pulled for a property. So there's all kinds of data here, which could be very useful to you. So the DOB Landlord Violations Tool includes 38,000 housing code violations over the past 4 years. So there is a ton of data. Now, once a landlord has abated a violation, it is removed from this database. So if your landlord received a violation and then fixed it and abated it, then the DOB will remove that information from this database, so it will not show up. But this database will show anything that they consider unabated at this point in time, which can be very useful. So this is the navigation. So these are the steps you would follow to go, and that's on your sheet that you have. But you can take a picture too. And these are the steps you would use to go to visit that landlord violations tool to find out what do they have outstanding. What kinds of violations are they receiving, right? Are these like huge life safety issues, or are they minor infractions like, chipped paint, things like that? So when you go to the tool, this is kind of, hopefully you can see that. This is a screenshot from what it looks like when you look up a random property. And I just typed in a random property just as an example. I'm not trying to pick on any property in particular. I just sort of picked one to show as an example there in a screenshot. So you would click on violations and abatement and scroll to the landlord violation tool and enter the name of the property, or even you can enter the name of the landlord and it would show up based on like who they have registered under that landlord. You can search for fiscal year, so you could see in the past year how many violations has this landlord had. You could search for several years. You could search for an owner name or a case number, or just look at all open violations. And it's going to show you what unit the violation was in. It's going to show you what date this property was inspected by the Department of Buildings investigator. It'll show you what room, like location that this was in. So sleeping room, bathroom, living room, etc. It'll tell you exactly what part of the code was violated and what the fine is. So if you can read it on there, that first fine is $24.36, so $2,436 for failing to have smoke alarms. So these fines can get really hefty for landlords. So this is something interesting, and that's a life safety issue. That's why that's such a hefty fine. So this can be valuable information for you. And first of all, I should caveat that by saying, if you do have issues in your apartment, please call the Department of Buildings to get their inspector to come out and issue these fines. But this is a way, if you're searching for rental housing, to find out, does this landlord have a lot of violations that are unabated? Are they major violations? Are they minor things? So this can be really useful if you're kind of researching that. Now, some violations are more serious than others. And depending on the severity, a landlord typically has 7 days to fix a life safety emergency and 30 to 60 days to fix a non-emergency. So you should compare the date on what violations you find and see, have they fixed these within the usual time frame, or are these way outstanding? Okay, so the next database I'm going to talk about is called Scout. And this is a collaboration between the Department of Buildings and the Department of Licensing and Consumer Protection, or the DLCP. For those who want to know the history, they used to be combined under one agency. Anyone remember what it was called? You got it. It was DCRA. So a few years back, they split that into two, but for some reason, they both share this Scout database. And so you can use this tool to find out whether your landlord has obtained a basic business license and a certificate of occupancy. You can find inspections and permits and all of that kinds of information. Now, I should caveat to say the certificate of occupancy is required except in single family dwellings. So if you live in a single family dwelling, like a row house that you're renting, for example, and you don't see a certificate of occupancy, that's not a violation. That's just, they're not required to get one. So again, this is the navigation, and it's on your sheet to how to get to the Scout website. It is going to ask you for a username and password, so you will have to create your own sort of like login. But once you've registered and logged in, you can search by address, business, or person name, or permit or license number. And what I like to do is you can even set up what they call a Scout alert for a specific address. So there's a building right next to where I live where they're about to demolish it and put in new apartments. So I set up a Scout alert so that anytime they pull a permit for that or they register for a new apartment license for that, I get an alert for it. So I get an email from Scout that says, hey, there was some sort of activity about the property next to you. So I think the Scout alert function is really useful, and I encourage you to use that if you have for your own property or maybe a neighboring property even that you're just curious about. So this is what it looks like. And again, I pulled a random property. I'm not trying to pick on anybody, but this is kind of what it looks like when you type in, an address or a building name or even a landlord name. You can find out who the current owner is, first of all. So it's going to tell you to some extent who owns the property. Now, often this is obscured under an LLC. So if you can read what it says here, I kind of cut it off a little bit for privacy reasons. But the owner is 151 something Preservation LLC, right? So we don't really know who that is. That's an LLC. That's a limited liability corporation. They're hiding behind this corporation. But you can look up, I'll tell you in a few slides, more information about that specific name. You can also find out when the property was last sold. So that'll tell you like ownership changes over time. And, has this property gone through the TOPA process recently? That will kind of tell you that information. It'll also tell you how the building is registered, whether it's registered as a single family unit, 2 to 4 units, or 5 or more units. So when tenants call me and they say, my property is about to go through the TOPA process. Does everyone know what TOPA stands for? Okay, so TOPA stands for, the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. And a brief synopsis of that means that when your property goes for sale, as of right now in DC, tenants have the sort of first right of refusal to try to purchase the property. And they get certain notices that the building is going for sale. And there's a whole process if they want to exercise their rights to try to buy the property. Oops, there we go. And so when tenants call me and say that they're about to go through the TOPA process, one of the first things I do is I look up this property address in Scout. Because it's going to tell me, is this 2 to 4 units? Is this 5 or more units? Who's the owner? Right, it's going to tell me that basic information, and then I can tell you from there how the TOPA process is going to operate, because that's all conditional, right? The process is conditional on those requirements. So there's a lot of information you can find here, and you don't have to look up just your own property. You can look up neighboring properties anywhere you're curious about. You can find the certificate of occupancy. You can find the basic business license. You can find zoning information if you care about the zoning. So for example, here it says ownership change, apartment buildings, 127 units, parking garage, 127 spaces, clubhouse, fitness center, pool. So you can find out all that information that they applied for when they originally made this a rental property, which is pretty cool. You can look at the zoning review, like when the city approved the zoning for building this property. So that's kind of interesting to some people, maybe. And then sometimes the owner of the building is registered as an LLC. So again, that's a little tricky, but there is limited information you can gather based on the name of the LLC. So this is the one thing I think in this spreadsheet that is not a DC government website. This is like a, worldwide website, I guess. It's called opencorporates.com. And on this website, you can just type in any corporation name, any LLC, and find out some information, not all of it. Some of it might be obscure, but you can find out some information about that corporation. So this little screenshot here is a picture of when I typed in the 151 blah blah Street Preservation LLC. Again, I bleeped out the name so that I'm not calling anyone out in particular, but you can see who might be an officer, whether they have an active corporation or whether it's expired, right? Maybe they were a company at one point and they've since lost their registration and need to reapply. It'll tell you sometimes an address associated with the LLC. So you can continue your search and look up that address and see what you can find, what names might be associated with that. So for number one, you can use Open Corporates to look up LLCs. So if you are owner of your property as an LLC, this would be a place to start. But the other thing you can use this for is looking up tenant associations. So tenant associations are not required to incorporate as a corporation, but they can. And if they do that, they're going to show up on this Open Corporates website. So if you want to look up if a property has an active tenant association, that's usually one of the first steps I take, is to look to see, did they incorporate, which is not required, but often they do. And if so, are they active? So this will tell you, it says status on their active. It'll tell you if they were active at one point, but have since expired and not renewed. It'll tell you potentially who the officers might be in the tenant association. So this could be a valuable tool if you're trying to find out if a property has or had a tenant association at one point. Again, for TOPA purposes, I find this to be really useful because you can find out, if the tenant association is exercising their TOPA rights and incorporating their tenant association in order to do that. And I already kind of said this. So you can find out, is there an active tenant association or was there one at one point? I have a screenshot of this property in particular because I want to point out that the tenant association might not necessarily be named the same name as the property address. Most of the time it is, but not always. So for example, this tenant association, and I blanked out the rest, tenant association, the name actually doesn't have the address in it. So just because you have an address and you're trying to find a tenant association, you might need to play around with some of your search terms because it might not exactly match what the address is of the property. Okay, so our next database, and we're back to DC government databases here. This is the Department of Energy and the Environment Enforcement and Compliance Database. So DOEE provides the public with information related to environmental inspections and administrative enforcement actions. This is kind of a little known database. A lot of people aren't really aware that this is here, but I think it's useful. So again, the navigation is on your sheet there, but it's also spelled out right here. And you can search records by address for lead-based paint violations or air quality infractions or other issues related to environmental problems. So if you're trying to find out, does this landlord have lead paint in the property, right? Especially if you have young kids, this might be a huge concern to you. So this is a way to find that out. So if you wanted to search for buildings with lead-based paint infractions, there's a little map that they give you when you log in. And you can use different, you can toggle to different violations and search terms to find out, is there lead-based paint issues here? And so it'll show you on the map, it's kind of hard to see, but all the little dots will show you, where there were potentially violations, and the color shows you what kind of violation there was. Now, the next database is the Rental Accommodations Division Rent Control Status. So this has existed for years, and what's happening right now is the Rental Accommodations Division is sort of switching all of their paperwork to a new website called the Rent Registry. But that's going to take a while to set up because it requires input from a lot of different sources, from landlords, from tenants, all of that. So the data's not all there yet. So even though the data's not there, they still have this treasure trove of data on the DHCD website. So you can actually search for old PDFs of rent registrations going back to like the 1970s even, with the Department of Housing and Community Development. So essentially what they did is they would take all of these registrations on paper, or anytime a landlord tried to take a rent increase, they'd have to put it on paper and give it to DHCD. And DHCD scanned all of those papers in and uploaded it to this website. So you can find those old scans. They're not always super clear, but you can find old scans and old PDFs showing rent control records of any property that's been registered with DHCD. And just for your reference, all landlords are required to register with DHCD. So if they're registered as rent controlled, then that says, yes, this property is subject to rent control. If they're registered as exempt from rent control, which some are, then they have to describe why. So there's a few different reasons they can use to describe why they're exempt from rent control. Now, if a landlord has not registered properly, then by default, the unit will be subject to rent control until they register to say, oops, we're not supposed to be. So this is what this portal looks like. And again, the navigation is on your sheet, but it's here as well. And they actually provide a username and password for you, so you don't have to come up with your own. You just type in the ones that they provide on that screen. When you log in, you want to click DHCD, HRA, RAD, public search. And then you can search by address. But this search bar is actually really finicky. So you want to make sure you're typing in the exact address and quadrant. Because if you don't type in it exactly right, it might say, oh, there's no results. So this one you have to be pretty exact with. So this is kind of a screenshot again of what it might look like. And I typed in a random address here just to find all of these filings. So anytime the landlord has filed something with the city, with DHCD specifically, about a particular unit, about a rent increase, registering a unit, all of those types of things, that document is going to be uploaded right here. So you can even sort it by date so that you can have the most recent documents at the top. And you can search by a particular unit number. So if you want to see what increases unit number 712 in this one building has received over decades, you can do that. You can find that information. And toward the right there, it's kind of a little screenshot of what the PDF looks like. So when you're in the internet on it, you can click on that PDF and pull it up larger, and it'll show you that actual record. So you can find previous rent filings, rent increases, housing provider petitions, all of that kind of data. So again, this is a database that I use really frequently to look up buildings and find out, how things have changed over time in those buildings. Okay, so continuing with DHCD, they also govern the TOPA filings. And I described what TOPA is again. It's Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. And so DHCD's Conversion and Sales Division contains records that have to do with TOPA. So if you've heard rumors that your property is about to be sold, likely you are either going to receive a notice of offer of sale or you've already received a notice of offer of sale. And if you're looking to exercise your TOPA rights, you can verify with DHCD what their filings are because they publish a weekly Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act report. They call it the weekly TOPA report. And I pull this up every Monday, and it details what TOPA-related filings they've received in the past week. So it's always going to be a week post-dated, which is kind of annoying. So it's never like yesterday's, right? It's always a little bit behind. But it will tell you anytime they've received any sort of notice from a landlord, statement of interest from tenants, a tenant association registration, a TOPA complaint, right? Like if tenants complain that the TOPA process was done incorrectly, they'll tell you that on that report. They'll say, we received a TOPA complaint from this property. So I find this to be really useful too. And the navigation again is right there. It's also on your sheet. So this is what the report looks like. So it'll list all the different sort of types of sale and transfer over the previous week and exactly what address it is. It'll even tell you the sales price for some of these buildings. So this can be a treasure trove of information. And this is really useful to find out, to verify what stage of the TOPA process your building is in. So the way the TOPA process is supposed to work is that the same day that tenants receive the notice of offer of sale, DHCD is supposed to receive that notice of offer of sale. Well, you can verify that with this report because this report is telling you when DHCD received that notice of offer of sale. So you can go verify that your date matches their date. And if it doesn't, contact DHCD and you could potentially file a TOPA complaint. So this will tell you what's going on in the world of TOPA really on any given week. So anytime there's a building that's for sale, whether it's 2 to 4 units, whether it's a single family dwelling, it's going to show up here. That's how TOPA works in the city. So if there's a letter of interest from the tenants, that's toward the bottom. That'll show up here. So any sort of document that DHCD receives, they're going to put it on this report. Now, eviction lists. So this is useful if you're looking for a potential home and you'd want to find out, does this landlord evict tenants? Are they one of those landlords that is quick to send tenants to eviction court? And, do I want to live in a place like that? So the OTA, our office, maintains a list of upcoming scheduled evictions online. And this is provided to us by the U.S. Marshals Service. So essentially what happens is when a tenant is at the end of the eviction process and they have that writ for eviction and they have a date scheduled with the U.S. Marshals Service, the Marshals Service also informs us. So we also have this information from them and we publish these dates so that we make sure that tenants are aware that this is happening, right? We are sort of that second gap to make sure that nothing gets missed and that tenants are aware that this is going on. So this list can be used to evaluate whether there are upcoming evictions in the next 60 days at any certain address. So this is what it looks like, and I have blocked out addresses for privacy reasons, but this is available on our website. The navigation is right there. And again, we publish this weekly, so it'll tell you for the next 60 days, where are all the evictions happening in the city. This is also useful to see because you can see roughly how many are happening a day. And it varies, but 1, 2, 3, 4, about 10 or so a day on this report, maybe a little bit more. So that might be useful information for you. And also you can look up a specific address to see if this landlord is in the habit of evicting tenants. Now, DC Superior Court records. So does this landlord take tenants to court? If you're curious if this is one of those landlords who likes to do that, this is a way you could find that out. So they actually have a lot of public records available. You can find out whether the landlord has taken tenants to court for eviction, whether they've taken them to court for issues like small claims. And you can also verify whether your own eviction record has been sealed, right? Because if it's sealed, it's not going to show up on this publicly available data. So it says, note, not all existing records may be public, some may be sealed. If you have a sealed eviction record for an address or a property, it's not going to end up on this report. So if you're trying to verify that your own record is sealed, this is a good way to do that. So again, the navigation is here and it's on your page as well. This is a screenshot of what the court record website looks like, and you want to click search in portal toward the bottom there on the bottom left. So you can search by all kinds of stuff, really. You can search for a company name. So if you have a particular management company that you want to know if they evict people a lot, you could search for a management company. If you have a particular person's name, you could search for that. You could search for an address. So there's all kinds of information, again, to find here. So now that you've found all this information about your landlord, you've done all your research, was your landlord supposed to tell you any of this, right? Is this stuff that's supposed to be told to tenants? That's what I get asked a lot. So here are the things that the landlord is required to disclose at application. And it's some of the things we covered, but not all of it. So the landlord must disclose the basic business license number, the rental accommodations registration, the certificate of occupancy, the rent for the unit and whether or not the unit is subject to rent control, whether there's been mold in the unit in the previous 3 years, unless it was completely remediated by a licensed professional, a copy of our office's Bill of Rights, 2 different lead disclosures, one from the EPA and one that's local, and then a tenant right form issued by the DOE. So those are the things they're required to disclose, which doesn't cover everything I just talked about, right? They're not required to tell you who's in their LLC, for example, but they are required to tell you some rent control records, right? So we talked about that. So for example, they have to tell you what the previous 3 rent increases were if you're in a rent controlled unit. So some of the things we went over, they should be telling you already, but not everything. So that's why I would suggest do your own homework, do your research, find out what you can about a landlord. And then if the unit is rent controlled, they also have to disclose these things. So any pending petitions that might change the rent for the unit, a copy of any housing code violations issued by the Department of Buildings in the past year, a pamphlet published by the rent administrator explaining what's required for rent increases, and what the last 3 rent increases were for the unit and why were they taken. So for example, for the Department of Buildings violations, right, if you're in a rent controlled unit, they're supposed to be, disclosing those to you. If you're not in a rent controlled unit, they don't have to do that. So you might want to look that up. So let's see how I'm on time. Oh, okay. All right, so that's kind of the gist of what I got, but I'm happy to take any questions that you all have. Yeah, go ahead. Okay. Yeah, that was a lot in there. So if the building is for sale, the law requires them right now anyway, through TOPA to notify you when the building is for sale. So even if you're in a single family home and the landlord thinks you actually don't have TOPA rights, they're still required to send you a notice to say, hey, this is about to happen. So it sounds like there were certainly some missteps. What happened there? Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh. So if you have a lease and the building is sold, that does not invalidate your lease. So your lease is still a legal document. And what happens is you just pay your rent to the new landlord, whoever that is, but your lease contract still remains valid.
So I did a simple search using the sale number MMSL, and I saw that there were several plan changes of the property. So my question is, at every change, and this was just like 2 days after, so it's like the property was, owned by the mother, all of a sudden it's now, owned by the daughter, then the daughter sold to, my new landlady, and my new landlady now sold it back. And then, the mother, then bought, it was just complicated.
Wow.
So my question was that at every point of that change, wasn't I supposed to have been notified?
Yeah, anytime there is a sale, not a transfer, right? So there's a legal distinction between a sale and a transfer. I don't know exactly what that was for your case. So if they were transferring it to each other in some way, then potentially no. Potentially they would not have to inform you. But if they were selling, then yes, they were supposed to send you TOPA notice of that.
For each transaction. And then you mentioned the TOPA report, because I want others to do that. How far back is that report?
They have that posted to their website going back. It's very far. It's at least a year, if not longer. They have, every week's data for I think at least a year.
My fourth question I'll ask on because I just need you to talk about the line of violations too.
Sure.
I don't get.
Okay.
And then the last question is, if the DOB violations remain unabated, what next? I understand that, DOB then takes them on to Office of Administrative Welfare.
Right.
But my landlady is not interested in fixing anything. She's been dinged as I speak and stand here almost $100,000.
Wow.
And she hasn't abated. It is on the public website that she's putting this much. I'm told that after 20,000 they should be guarantee,
Mhm.
I know that, but none of that is happening in my situation.
Yeah, so there's another distinct process you could also use if you're just trying to get things fixed, and that's called going to housing conditions court. I don't know if you've heard of that or had experience with that before. Sometimes the nickname for that is HCC court, but it's called housing conditions court. And it's a distinct court. It's not like landlord tenant court where the landlord sues the tenant, right? This is where the tenant files in HCC court against a landlord. And it's not for, a windfall of money. It's just to get things fixed, right? So the tenant would say to the judge, I have all of these issues. And then the judge would order that the landlord abates them. So you're getting an order from a judge to a landlord to say you have to fix these things.
Is this superior to the DOB?
I don't know about superior, but it's a distinct process separate from DOB. Yeah. It's called Housing Conditions Court, or HCC Court. Yeah.
And what difference does it make if the landlord doesn't have a business license?
Oh, that's a great question. So if a landlord does not have a business license, they cannot get very far in landlord and tenant court, because one of the first things that's required when they're filing against a tenant for eviction in landlord tenant court is they have to show their business license. They have to show that they've registered, all of those types of things. So they wouldn't be able to do that if they couldn't produce a business license. Yeah. Okay.
Business license introduced to occupancy, did they ever expire their and also changing ownership of property?
Certificate of occupancy, they don't have to renew. That kind of stays. Unless they do something to the property to change it. So if they're doing like a major renovation, they might have to add to that COO. But the business license, they do have to renew that. So often you'll find a landlord has a business license that expired. I want to say it's every 2 years. I could be wrong on that. I think it's every 2 years that they're supposed to renew it, but I could be off.
And it's supposed to be standing.
It is, yes.
So it's probably sold, but the old information is still there.
They're supposed to get it with the new ownership. So the new owner is supposed to get their own new business license. Yeah. No, they don't. If it's a non rent controlled unit, then they don't have to tell the city that they're raising the rent. I wish they did. Go ahead. Say they have to provide a so if they have outstanding housing code violations, where is it? Oh, okay, yeah. If they're a rent controlled building and they have housing code violations within the past 12 months, they have to give that to the tenant at application. If they're a non-rent controlled building, they are not obligated to do that. In the back. I know. Yeah.
Hey, the last 12 months we've had these violations. I don't know what in my experience. Going back quite some time, not being honest, it's real.
Yeah. Now, in practice, do they really do it?
So can I go back and say, geez, 7 years ago, you never provided this for me?
You could, yeah.
Therefore, I'm taking you to which court would I take? Litigious as I am.
You could. I mean, it depends on if the violation actually affected you back then. If you lived there 7 years ago, I guess. But yeah, I guess that would be HCC court, right? You go to housing conditions court, potentially.
Is this actually, is this actually followed in the news?
Not often.
My situation is, this is my second time I just moved out, the first, September 2nd, and this is my second time living in 2 different properties with the landlord. I don't know how you gonna end up owning both properties or whatever, and they were 50 years apart. But I need to know, how do I, on here, can I look and see if he own other properties, because in the first 2 properties, he was just entering my house when he got ready to shut down my utilities, and I was calling the utility company, and they didn't tell me I had a credit on my bill and my stuff was still on. But then by the time I got off the phone with them and going home or whatever stuff, my stuff would be back on.
Hmm.
And I just got tired of that.
Yeah, so if you have the name of an LLC or even a landlord, if you have just a guy who owns like a house or something and he's your landlord, if you use the Scout database, you can search by name, and it'll be a business name or just personal name, and it'll show you any properties that are associated with that name. So it'll show you any property that they own in the district.
So only two can I report that for those fractions or whatever?
So you wouldn't report him on this database, but you could call the Department of Buildings or the Department of Licensing if you think there's a licensing issue, and report him there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead. Hmm. Yeah, so if the landlord has not registered the unit, then by default it is subject to rent control. Because registration is essentially saying, oh, this unit is exempt from rent control because of XYZ reason. So if they never bothered to file that, then it shouldn't be exempt from rent control. So then yes, there would be potentially a limit to what rent increase you could receive. So you could challenge that potentially with the landlord if you'd like to. Yeah, for that instance, if you'd like assistance with doing that, you can contact our office, and our attorney advisors can help you with that. Because if they get in touch with your landlord to help you challenge it, I think that might hold more weight, maybe. So yeah, I would say call our attorney advisors. We can help. Yeah. This one? Well, so the entire housing code and property maintenance code is available online, but it's extremely lengthy. Like, it's hundreds of pages worth. So you click through the link of what particular kind of housing code violation you're looking for, and then you can read the code, the statute. So yes, that is available. It's just a lot of information, so you kind of have to parse through it. It's on the Department of Buildings website. So if you search for Department of Buildings housing code, it'll probably be one of the first links that comes up. Yeah, the full code, yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So DOB has on their, separate from that, which is the whole code listed, they do have sort of almost like a one pager, like a one screen kind of thing, I guess, on their website that lists like common housing code violations. I don't know if it cites the code specifically on those though, but it does say here are the top 20 things to look for, you know. Yeah.
How does the Scout database also violations database, and also how do you get scored violations? Violations of a building that gets cited,
Yeah.
that they do whatever, it's up to the citing.
Yeah, so unfortunately they remove those. Where's the website? Oh, I guess it was this. They remove those once it's been abated, and there is not a way that you could publicly achieve that data. You could potentially FOIA, I suppose, for that information. So they don't make that public once it's been abated, unfortunately.
This is just one of the big real estates in town, Eastern Washington District, investment trust in that. We are liquidating a lot of properties in the district, especially that. How long do we give them? How big do you know shit how it goes? I found out it was just backwards. Would you say they have, what is the timeline that they have to put this in?
Timeline that they have to put the violations up?
No, not the violations, I'm selling.
Oh, I see. Okay, so when a building, you're talking mostly about like 5 or more unit buildings, like large general buildings. So when a 5 or more unit building goes for sale, they have to send the tenants either a notice of offer of sale with contract or without contract. So they can wait until they get a contract to actually notify the tenants. But once they do go under contract, they are required to notify the tenants. and the tenants have, depending on how organized they are, they have potentially 45 days to, organize their tenant association and like exercise their rights.
You saw that in the alley.
Yeah, that's down the street.
So Arlington was minor involved in that.
Yeah, there were like 4 buildings in the Noma area, and they just recently,
Tenants voted for Smith.
Right.
As opposed to the housing.
right.
Firstly, again, I want to thank you because I don't know where I would be.
Yeah.
You guys heard, in the picture. I've been terrorized. I continue to be terrorized by my landlord on this same, issue. It was through OTA that I found out that there was no business license on the building. So through them also, I was directed to a back and forth. This is eviction attempt number 5.
Wow.
And over the past 2 years, and I have stood steadfast that you can't, as you said, they can't go further at the courts. So what the landlord has done now is to file something called an ejectment
Okay.
that my lease expired. She didn't really, but leases don't expire in DC.
Right.
It says, to me. And she keeps taking me to court. They keep dismissing, she keeps taking, as I said, we're currently in round 5. And I'm getting really tired. Mentally, it is distressing
Yeah.
because, I'm trying to enforce my legal tenant rights and I'm being harassed, victimized, bullied, all those things. So my question is, hearing it from you again, that the case can't move forward, it has to be dismissed by the judges. How can I get that to stop? That's question 1. Question 2 is, now she's trying to do something called a moving eviction. She currently stays somewhere in Pennsylvania, and I know she still has that apartment because she'll come to mine and disappear. How do I, do whatever to verify ownership of the other apartment so that I can show in court that in bad faith, she doesn't really want to stay, she just wants, to use that to
Well, yeah. So for the answer to your second question, so the Scout database will show ownership records of who owns what property. So if you type in her name, it should show any property that's associated with her. So Scout would show you that. To the first part of your question, that would be something I think you should speak with our legal team about, because I don't know exactly what the answer would be. Okay.
As I said, once one case gets dismissed,
She just does it again. Yeah.
It's tiring to me.
Yeah.
I'm sure your officers are getting a bit, tired of.
She sounds litigious, right? She sounds like she's
I don't know why she feels she's entitled. I don't know why the laws are not protecting the tenants, against people like that. So
Yeah.
that's just like she doesn't have the license. She cannot get the license. She keeps coming up with all sorts of things every, quarter or whatever to try to get me out. And I'm like, follow the law. There is code here. It's not ambiguous. It's clear. Follow the law. Instead, she lawyers up. Now she has something off with comment. I'm sure
I've heard of them. Yeah.
They're like the top, that's
Right.
how crazy she's getting.
Right.
They're trying to stop me. And that's retaliation. That's illegal under the law. So my question is, why am I not being protected from that continuous,
Yeah, and sometimes even when you get anyone really, tenant, landlord, whatever, who's so litigious and they keep filing in court, sometimes the judges get tired of it, right? Because they have those records. They know who's been continuously filing, and sometimes they'll try to put a stop to it and reprimand that person. I don't know what that takes necessarily to get them to do that, but I would say talk with our attorney advisors.
There's a new provision she's brought up now in the code. It says that somebody who wants to take ownership of the property that they own as the primary residence, something, must just give the tenant 90 days notice, and that they can then take over the property. I'll give you that document.
Okay.
So my confusion is, I thought all cases have to go through an eviction process, but it's like with the lettering of this particular ordinance that once she just gives me a 90 days notice, she can take over, she can kick me out.
Well, they need to give, and I don't know if this is specific to your situation, but when they are moving into the unit themselves and using it for their own personal use, personal occupancy and use is what it's called, then they can give a 90-day notice. But I don't know if that's what's happening here or not. It doesn't really sound like she's actually moving in. So I'm not totally sure. But I,
moved into the basement, but
okay.
I said she owns the other property.
Right.
But technically she's, in residence. That's
Right.
what she's paying now.
Okay. Yeah, unfortunately I can't answer it. Yeah, go ahead. Sure. Anyone can sue anyone for anything. Talk with our attorneys, and they'll be able to help you. Yeah. Let me see real quick how we are in time. Okay, so we have time for a few more questions. Yeah, go ahead in the back.
I want to know, say like if a new company comes in and buys the property, and then they turn around and offer people, money to move out, where would you go to find out on the DC, website, what were the conditions and what was the actual value that they had to pay the tenants to move out?
I wish that information was publicly accessible. Boy, I tell you. So what you're describing is a buyout, which typically happens during the TOPA process or when they're trying to renovate a building and they think it's easier to do it without the tenants being there. So they say, look, tenant, I'll give you X amount of dollars if you decide to leave in 30 days. And the tenant can take it or they can say, no, thanks. And oftentimes the tenant takes it because, sometimes it can be a significant amount of money. I wish that was publicly accessible. They are not even required. Usually that's written. There's like a signed agreement that tenants sign with the landlord to make that happen, and it's called a development agreement, or sometimes called a buyout agreement. And that is not required to be shared with the district government. So that is a contract between the tenant and the landlord.
Yeah, but we refuse to sign the papers because I feel like they was pressing us to sign the papers, and I refused because I said if I find out that they supposed to pay us more money, then I'd be signing my rights away, not to be able to go back and sue them.
Yeah. And the problem with that too is that often if they're trying to get tenants to leave, they'll offer a significant amount of money that it sounds significant at the time, but then the cost to find more affordable housing and the cost to move, right? It actually eats up a lot of that money. So yeah, go ahead.
What are the rights of tenants and TAs to get information about things like real utility bills, what actually is
Oh, great question. Yeah.
what maintenance has been done, how allocations of square footage of the building, I know the TA, and we're always trying to figure out how they do buildings correctly, and also related to that. When you build in arrears, means the current residents are paying former residents.
That's right.
Former months.
Yeah.
And what are the rights of the tenants or the right TA to say, sorry, you can't do that, or at least tell us so that we can.
Yeah. Are you in a Brookfield property?
Now that Grace
Graystar. Oh, okay. So Brookfield and Navy Yard is also doing the same thing. Right. Okay. So the good news is council is, I think in October, taking up legislation on that exact issue, because this is tenants across the city are complaining about this, where especially in these like big corporate buildings, landlords are charging tenants for utilities and the charges kind of come out of nowhere. Right? There's no real there's some crazy formula that says we take the square footage of the unit and the occupancy and blah, blah, blah. And then the, HVAC for the common area. And it's not clear to anybody where these fees are coming from. So the problem is that there's no clarity right now. And the lease says usually something to the effect of like, here's the formula we use to calculate that. And the landlord thinks that's sufficient to meet the qualifications, which are that it should be explained to you clearly where this is coming from. So council is taking up legislation on that. Councilmember Robert White and I think Councilmember Charles Allen are the ones who are kind of spearheading that. So I would say reach out to your council members and say, hey, we feel very strongly about this issue. here's what I've experienced. Because I understand I think they're voting on it and assuming everything like nationally goes okay. I think they're going to take that up very soon. And our office has also submitted statements to the council members to the same effect, saying like tenants are experiencing this. We need clarity on this.
You have any rights right now? I go to the building and say, I'd like to see everyone bills. Yeah, we'll get them to. There's a point where I can file something in the city.
So
you'll be filed and says, you know what? Bill provided 7, 10, 12 months. Here's evidence. Bill missed the last 3 months back.
yeah.
Again, violation cited.
The problem is that's not written into the law right now. So that's what this legislation would do, is require that the landlord provides that documentation, because at the moment it's not required. It's required that they tell you where the usage is coming from, but they seem to think that providing that formula is sufficient to meet that requirement. Not that I know of, but maybe. I'm not sure. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So if it hasn't been legislated, can some kind of process be established by suing them, maybe coming up with the tenants to be able to come up with their own formula?
Well,
And go to court and get the court to decide whose formula is folks prefer.
potentially, I guess, but I mean that's right. We don't know. Yeah, I mean potentially. I don't know. I don't know. You might want to talk with our policy director about that specific issue, because he's been Joel Cohen, Cohn. He's been working on that issue because our policy team sent that statement to council saying like we feel very strongly about this issue. So you might want to follow up with him on like what else could be done.